The Holy Gospel according to St. Mark, the 2nd chapter.
Glory to you, O Lord.
One Sabbath, Jesus was going through the grain fields, and as they made their way, his disciples began to pluck heads of grain. The Pharisees said to him, "Look, why are they doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath?" And he said to them, "Have you never read what David did when he and his companions were hungry and in need of food? He entered the house of God when Abiathar was high priest, and ate the bread of the presence, but it is not lawful for any but the priest to eat, and he gave some to his companions." Then he said to them, "The Sabbath was made for humankind, and not humankind for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath." Again he entered the synagogue, and a man was there who had a withered hand. They watched him to see whether he would cure him on the Sabbath, so that they might accuse him. And he said to the man who had the withered hand, "Come forward." Then he said to them, "Is it lawful to do good or to do harm on the Sabbath, to save life or to kill?" But they were silent. He looked around at them with anger. He was grieved at their hardness of heart, and he said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." He stretched it out, and his hand was restored. The Pharisees went out and immediately conspired with the Herodians against him, how to destroy him. The Gospel of the Lord. About 7 years ago, I embarked on a family experiment of Sabbath keeping. I was not serving this congregation here, but I was occasionally filling in on Saturday evenings, so it's possible that a few of you remember this experiment. I had read a book about Sabbath keeping with families, and it stirred in me a desire to slow things down, to breathe and fast and behold. And I think I sort of wanted to cheat time, because at that time my boys were no longer babies. Middle school and high school days were banging at the door of my heart, and I had begun to realize that much of our time together was hardly together time. And soon they would be forging lives of their own. Rushing to and fro from practices and rehearsals was normal. Hurried dinners where someone was almost always absent was normal. And endless homework assignments paired with my hectic work schedule as a solo pastor and the overwhelming busyness of being a solo parent. I had begun to realize the truth of the statement, "Don't blink, it goes by fast." And so, as a pastor, the observation of the Sabbath seemed logical. Fast forward to now, and this reality is so in my face. I am both amazed at who my children are becoming, while simultaneously trying not to curl myself up into a fetal position in a ball of tears, because what I knew was coming came. At that time, although this is also true now, just in different ways, at that time, it was not one thing alone that was burdensome, but taken all together, I often felt like I'd never get on top of it all. I am a planner, an organizer, and basically clutter raises my anxiety to ridiculous levels, causing me to become somewhat of a whirlwind of doing. So I would use all of my free time to catch up on chores and errands. But this meant that there was no regular set-aside time for me to rest or for fun, no time for lingering or rejuvenation, no time to delight and take stock. This was and is something dysfunctional about the way we are living, disconnected from one another, and living my life as if I was indispensable and somehow the world needed me to keep it spinning. And so I embarked on my Sabbath experiment. Saturdays and Sundays were out for numerous reasons, so we chose Thursday afternoons. We'd go bowling, eat fondue together, watch a movie, talk, laugh, play board games. It was great. We only lasted 6 weeks. So basically I failed at the Sabbath, which if I remember correctly is one of the 10 Commandments. So I'm not always so great at this gig that God calls me to. I was reminded of my failed experiment when I read this week's lessons for a couple of reasons. The first obvious reason is because our gospel takes place on the Sabbath, so it's not a far stretch. The second reason, which matters to me greatly, is the manner in which Jesus approaches the Sabbath. He doesn't always observe the Sabbath the way people expect him to. and he's constantly getting into trouble for what he does or does not do on the Sabbath. So Jesus' rebellion gives me hope. This doesn't mean that Jesus doesn't believe the Sabbath isn't important or one shouldn't observe it, but rather when he declares the Sabbath was made for humankind and not the humankind for Sabbath. It suggests that we are free to make the Sabbath our own, figure out how it will work for us. Jesus seems to do that. He takes the Sabbath seriously while finding his own way. I like to think he sort of stepped in and out of the Sabbath as needed. He certainly did, as at least technically speaking, when he healed a man and plucked grain. Both actions are forbidden under the rubric of work on the Sabbath. Now maybe I've stepped out of the Sabbath for 7 years, and that's not exactly what Jesus had in mind, but hopefully no one's counting. Life just got too busy. I mean, what is appealing about the Sabbath are the elements of togetherness, intentionality, and mindfulness. A day to simply be in unhurried wonder sounds heavenly. But I do not have time to have less time. You know what I mean? Plus, I also now have a 22-month-old, and there is nothing unhurried about her unless it's time to leave the park, and then she becomes interested in every rock and blade of grass along the way. And I have a husband and 3 boys, and, well, you all get it. I need more time, not less. And let's face it, the Sabbath, whether it's a whole day or just part of the day, means reducing the amount of time we have to get things done. Taking time out just means that things are going to be more hectic at the back end. But it's also true that I'm never going to be caught up. I joke that laundry is my nemesis, but truly, the moment I get every stitch of clothing washed, there is another load to do, even if I only count the clothes that are on my body and my family's bodies. There will always be more bills to be paid, groceries to be purchased, cat boxes to be cleaned, mouths to be fed. What this reality reminds me of is that even with a full 168 hours in a week, no matter how hard I work, there will be always more work to do, which is a little bit depressing. But I suspect that God had a similar thought after he created humanity on the 6th day. You know, I better take a break tomorrow and bask in the sun and enjoy the apple trees, because there's bound to be a new problem to solve come day 8. And as we all know, it didn't take long for there to be problems in the Garden of Eden. Sabbath won't solve the scarcity of time. But it does give us hope that by setting aside time for holiness to happen, it can and will. And so I'm wondering anew how to find rest in God, how to enjoy those who are most precious to me, and how to live with deliverance. Now, I obviously approach this question from my own personal perspective and reality. A mother of 4 with widely varying needs and interests. I'm a wife for the 2nd time around, and divorce has taught me that relationships are work, and caring for them is crucial. And as you all know, I'm also a pastor who sometimes takes things on that aren't mine to take on, and I often feel as if I failed. So all these truths impact how Sabbath might make its way back into my life, and also highlight the challenges in observing the Sabbath for me. But my reality isn't necessarily your reality. Some of your lives reflect mine, and this I know. We've had conversations about keeping up and hardly making it, about travel, soccer, and daycare costs. But there are those among us that are retired from careers and now feel as if we have all the time in the world, but still longing for the intellectual stimulation of vocation and the chaos of children. And there are those among us who may just be working to make ends meet. Contemplating Sabbath time or rest time is a luxury that one does not have, which is not affordable. And there are those among us who work shift jobs, passing our partners like ships in the night, just so someone is always home with the kids. A weekly day as a family unit is an impossibility, or our boss demands long hours and 24/7 access to us. We all have different ways in which our lives are structured, some of which we can and cannot control. And we all have different things that bring us joy and connect us to others and draw us closer to God. But regardless of what your personal situation is, I'd like to invite you to consider how you might intentionally build Sabbath into your life. Because I don't think it's going to just happen. Even with all the time in the world, we will squander it. Certainly Sundays work for some, but maybe an hour every morning with your coffee cup and a book of poems will center you in your relationship with God and others, slow you down, and bring you rest. Maybe it's every 2 weeks. Maybe that's what you can afford. Or maybe it's Monday afternoons. I cannot give you a prescription to holiness, which is perhaps why Jesus doesn't get his tunic and a wad over how the Sabbath is practiced. But I do believe that Jesus is totally on point in the gospel story today, which I know is shocking, Jesus being right and all. The Sabbath is a place to get healed, a time to become wholer. I do think that almost everyone here would welcome thicker peace in their lives. And I think that Sabbath is at least part of that antidote. It's funny because the observation of the Sabbath, especially by Christians, is somewhat of an antiquated practice. I read something this week written by a biblical commentator that said, most of the other texts deal with Sabbath keeping, which is not a big interest for today's children or adults. So as you can tell, I picked the least appealing thing to preach on. But honestly, it may not be sexy, but when it gets down to it, what's not to like? Healing, rest, connection, slower pace, less noise, realizing that things can wait. I'm so on board. But practically speaking, as I contemplate how this might look in my life, what I find truly ironic is the Sabbath is simple, but it's not easy. It is simple to walk at a leisurely pace from the park, marveling at the wonder of my daughter. But it's not easy to not hurry her along, so dinner can be made and nighttime rituals can get started. And it's simple to pray and thank God for what has graced our days. But it's not easy to pay attention to the everyday beauty that unfolds before our eyes, especially if there's a cell phone in front of our face all the time. Anyway, you get the picture. It won't be easy. And I haven't quite decided how that looks for my family yet. Maybe it's Thursdays again, maybe it's Sunday evenings. But I do know that life moves pretty fast, and if you don't stop and look around once in a while, you could miss it. Hat tip to Ferris Bueller, who apparently was preaching the gospel of Jesus Christ and didn't even know it. So I would invite you to consider taking the Sabbath on as an experiment